Hello everyone. Today we're looking at the problem count cells in overlapping horizontal and vertical substrings, which is question 3 in Biweekly contest 155. So before we start, I want to say that even though this question is a medium, I think it's kind of crazy. This should definitely be a hard, and you'll see why. There are various kind of prerequisite problems that you have to be familiar with, various techniques that I would not expect to need in a medium problem. So just keep that in mind as you go through that. If you had trouble with this one, very understandable because it's actually a pretty tricky question in my opinion. So the question reads that we are given an m by n matrix called grid consisting of characters and also a string called pattern. So a horizontal substring is a contiguous sequence of characters read from left to right in this grid. If the end of a row is reached before a substring is complete, we can wrap around to the next row. Similarly, for a vertical substring, it's a contiguous sequence of characters read from top to bottom. If we reach the bottom of a column before the substring is complete, we can wrap around to the next column. You'll see what this means when we actually look at the example. So what we actually want to do in this problem is find the number of cells that are part of at least one horizontal substring and at least one vertical substring where both substrings match the given pattern. So given this example, you can see we have this grid here. So we'll see that in red right here, this is our vertical substring that matches our pattern because our pattern here is A, B, A, C, A. And then here is our horizontal substring, so A, B, A, C, A. You notice in this case, we see an example of the wrapping. So the substring actually starts here, but we don't finish it until we get to this fourth row right here. So the substring starts in the third row and wraps down to the fourth row. So this is a good example of how exactly the wrapping will work and how we need to take care of this. So the output here would be 1 because there's only one cell that is part of both a vertical substring as well as a horizontal substring. You can see the kind of purplish color here, which is that C. So let's look at this same example. So we're going to need two main things to actually solve this problem. So first is we have to do some string matching. So the reason we do string matching is because we need to handle wrapping around the grid and checking for substrings, right? So potentially we could start here, but have to go all the way down to say like here, right? To match a substring. So this is going to be hard to do in a grid. So really what we want to do is kind of reformat this as two strings. We're going to have a string that starts here and goes horizontally. So it'll be one long string representing the horizontal order of this grid. Then we'll have another one representing the vertical order. So we'll start here, we'll go down, come up to the next column. So we're going to have two strings basically. We're going to have one that is horizontal and one that is the vertical order of the grid. And what we want to do here is we need to actually find instances of the substring in both of these strings that we've generated. So there's a couple ways to do this. And this is why I said this is a bit tricky for a medium problem, right? We could use one of these techniques. We could use a rolling hash technique like ribbon carp. We can use KMP, and we can use Z function. So for this question, I'm going to use Z function. I'm not going to go really in depth into how it works, but I recommend to look up one of these, really understand how it works so you can apply it to this problem. The other thing we're going to need is merging intervals. So merging intervals is a pretty famous Leetcode problem. You should probably know it. If you don't, I would recommend looking it up and understanding how it works. But again, there's going to be a element of merging intervals here. It won't really come into play in this example, but you will see exactly how we use this in another example that I give. Okay, so now we have our two strings representing both the horizontal order as well as the vertical order. So now what we want to do is we want to apply one of these string matching algorithms to these strings. So I'm going to use Z function here. I'm not going to go into exactly how it works, but basically what will happen is that we're going to match a prefix of the string to this string and see where it matches up. So the prefix we're going to use is going to be our pattern. So A, B, A, C, A. And essentially what will happen is that if we ever have a match of this pattern in the string, we're going to have a number essentially that represents the length of this pattern. So you'll see the match would be here. So we'd have a 5 here representing the A, B, A, C, A that we match with, right? And similarly here, we'll use the same pattern as our prefix, and here we'll get A, B, A, C, A right at the start. So for these questions, these are really the only matches. So you'll imagine what we get back when we process these strings with our z function is something like this. I'm just kind of writing random letters here. This is not really meaningful, but you're basically going to see, something like this. So we're going to have a bunch of these letters and numbers. Basically what we want to do is we want to look for the occurrences where the number is the same length as our pattern. And what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that at this location, starting at this location in the string, we have an exact match of the pattern, right? And these patterns are what we are looking for in this problem so that we can identify where the horizontal and vertical patterns overlap. So now that we have this, what do we actually do? Well, you might think, how do we actually want to record and check for overlaps? Well, what if, for example, we did the horizontal, right? So what if we found this, for example, and then we kind of went through, we could record, say, index 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, right? So we could do something like this, where let's say that at index 10, we found a match. And this is not the exact index right now. I'm just using an example. So what we could do is say, for my horizontal matches, let's actually use an interval. So we could say, from index 10 to 10 plus 5, so 15, I know that I have a match, right? Because I looked at index 10, I saw that at index 10, I saw 5 for my z index, so I know that the next 5 letters are going to equal that pattern, right? So really what we're doing is we're going to go through and we're going to collect essentially all of these different matching instances. Okay, so this is what, in this example, the matches we'd actually get, right? So we'll see in the horizontal string, I have a match from indices 9 to 14, and then from here, I have a match from 0 to 5 in my vertical string. So how do we actually use this information? Well, these numbers aren't super meaningful in terms of matching. So the 9th index we'd run into in our horizontal string would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right here, this string. However, the 9th in the vertical order is different. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Sorry, actually it'd be this one because we're doing 0 index, right? So here you see that we actually have different if we're just counting by 9. So we can't use exactly just these values. So we need to actually convert them to a grid value that we can reliably use and check with. So for horizontal, our row value, what we could do is just a little bit of math where we take that index and we're going to divide it by the length of our columns in our grid. So what is this going to do for us? So basically we'll say, I want to take my index 9, divide it by the length of our columns, which is 4, and here what I'm going to get is 2. So now I'm going to be in the second row, which is correct here if we look at this space. Then the column is going to be that same number, but then we're going to mod it by that number, right? So now we're going to get 1. So now we've gotten that our cell in the grid is 2, 1, which we see is correct. So then we could use this calculation to actually know, okay, this is the spot in the grid that I am talking about with this number. So we're basically going to do that for everything in our rows, and we're going to record them in a hash map just so that we can use them again later. So now what I've done is I've gone through all of the indices in this range and put them in this hash map here. So this accurately represents our horizontal substring and all of the matching cells that we have seen. Now what we need to do is something similar for our vertical. So what we do for the vertical is the same thing, but the calculation is slightly different. So for the vertical, we're going to do something slightly different where we're going to take the index, but instead of doing it by the column length, we're going to do it by the row length. So instead here, we're going to take the index and just divide it by the length of our grid. So the column here is going to be backwards. This is going to be divided by the length of the grid. So we're going to have is 0 here divided by 5, which is going to equal 0, which checks out. This is our 0th spot. And then let's do another example, or just do our row first. So row is going to be our index mod 5 as well, equals 0. So basically, similar structure. We're going to do this calculation to get the grid values. So now what we can do is we can take this and we can compare it to what's in our hash map. And we can say, okay, well, let's look and see if 0, 0 is in here. And what does it mean if 0, 0 is in here? Well, if it is, right, this means that we've found a cell where it's both part of a vertical substring, like we confirm here, but also a previous horizontal substring that we found here. So really what we're doing here is we're breaking this pattern down, or this problem down, into a couple steps. So we're going to process these strings and find all the instances of the matching substrings. Then what we're going to do is convert it to these grid values, and using those grid values we can kind of find any cell that belongs to both a horizontal and a vertical, and we can record it. So I also talked about interval merging, which is something we haven't touched on yet. So I want to show you exactly where this comes into play. Let's look at this example here where our entire grid is just G's, and then our pattern is GG. So what would happen here is, let's say we get our horizontal matches. We basically have one from 0 to 2. We'd have another one from 1 to 3, another one from 2 to 4. So you can kind of see this pattern here, where basically we have a lot of overlapping intervals. So this is why we need to also merge intervals, because in this case it doesn't look too bad. But what if we had something where our interval goes from 0 to 1,000? Then we had one where our interval goes from 1 to 1,001. Then we're going to go from 2 to 1,002, right? You can see that if we handled all of these individually, what would end up happening is that we would do a lot of repeated work, because we're going from 0 to 1,000, then we're going back to 1 again and doing them all again. So what would be ideal here is if we actually merge them. So these three intervals would become the interval 0 to 1,002, right? So instead of processing a lot of these cells multiple times, we're just going to do that one time. So we're going to do the extra step in this problem of, once we actually find the intervals that are matches in our strings, what we're going to do is just apply the merge intervals algorithm to make sure that we're not doing any repeated work that we do not have to do. Let's hop over to the code and see exactly how this works. So we're going to have a couple helper functions here just to allow us to do some of these operations and keep the code a bit cleaner. So the first is merging our intervals. So I'm not going to go super in-depth into this. This is another Leetcode problem that you should study and understand. But basically what this is going to do is we're going to take in a set of intervals, and any that overlap, we're just going to make sure that we combine them. And this, like we said, is going to allow us to avoid a lot of duplicate work. So really all we're doing here, taking in intervals, merging them, and then returning an array representing those merged intervals. Then we have another function, which is our z function. And what this is going to do is apply our z function string algorithm. Again, won't go super in depth into this. Go look up a video on this if you want more information. But it's a pretty helpful algorithm for just matching instances of substrings in a string. So essentially what we're going to return is an array at the end, where each element in the array represents, starting from that point, how much are we matching? How many characters are we matching? So anytime we have an element in here that's the same length as our pattern, we know that we have a full substring match. So here's the actual logic of our problem. So what we're going to do first is generate that horizontal and vertical string. So it's going to have two variables here. First, I do this loop to go through and get the horizontal string, and then one for the vertical string as well. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply my z function on both of these strings. So I'm doing something you might not be familiar with here, but basically a pretty common practice when using the z function is that we're matching on a prefix, right? So what we're really doing here is saying that the prefix that I want to match on is the pattern. I'm using this $sign to differentiate where the prefix starts and ends, right? So essentially what I'm doing is saying this is the prefix. Let's separate the prefix from the actual string. And we're going to do that for both the horizontal and vertical. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get back both of these arrays representing how many matches we have at each point. Then this is where we're going to start getting my actual intervals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, if at any point the match amount in my z function arrays match the length of my pattern, I know that I found a full substring match, so I'm going to append, starting from this point here, to I plus the length of pattern. So that will represent the full range of that substring. Then I'm going to apply the merge intervals here. So what will happen here is I'll still have my array of intervals, but it'll just be merged and any redundant intervals will be taken care of. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my logic to actually find the grid values from the horizontal matches first. So I'm going to, for each match, I'm going to first do an adjustment. So what I get back from my z function has the count of the prefix built in, right? So say, for example, my pattern is 5. If I'm matching from the first actual element of the string, it would be counting that prefix that we added in the beginning up here, as well as that $sign, right? Which we don't want. So I'm just adjusting for that here and saying, say, for example, my start value that I'm getting is 6. I know that actually represents index 0 because the length of my pattern is 5 and I have to account for 1 with the $sign as well. So it's just a little adjustment just to make things a little bit simpler, but really what we're doing is taking that z function value, which doesn't fully represent the index in our original string, and modifying it to do that. Then here I'm getting the row and column for this value. So basically I do I divided by length of grid 0, and then the column is I mod length of grid 0, and then I will add this into my hash set up here. So now at this point, what this means is that I have gotten everything, all the grid values for the horizontal substring. So all the horizontal substrings that match, I have all the cell values now in this set. Now I'm going to process the vertical. So very similar, can go through the vertical matches, do the same adjustment. Here the calculation is slightly different. So the column is going to be I divided by length of grid, row is I mod length of grid. Then this is where I do the check. So if this row and column, if I've seen these in the horizontal substring matches, then I know that this is a valid one that I can count towards my answer. But you'll notice that I'm not just adding it here. I'm not just adding, like, incrementing a variable or anything. I'm adding it into a set. This is because it's very possible that we could have overlaps in between substrings, and I want to record them once. So for this reason, when I do find the cell that has both a horizontal substring match and a vertical substring match, I'm just going to put it in a set and ensure that I only count it once. Then finally, at the end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return the length of matched cells. And matched cells represents the cells that I've seen both as part of a vertical substring as well as a horizontal substring. So let's submit and make sure that it works. And it does work. So this is definitely a very hard one. There's a lot of pretty advanced techniques that you need to use here. So I think this should be a hard problem. If you couldn't get it, don't feel bad. It is definitely a pretty difficult one. But hopefully this is helpful. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.